I picked up this new workout routine in the last few weeks. It really works the core incredibly well. I end up doing several hundred reps a day. It's called viral coughing. Excuse me. In fact, I may have picked it up from one of you guys. And I tell you, it just tightens everything up there. It's fairly easy. If you'd like to know how to do it, I'd be glad to whisper in your ear and you'll pick it up really quick too. I want to remind you that even though it seems pretty intuitive to think of what we do here in other terms, we are not a spiritual version of a restaurant. We are not a spiritual rendition of a movie theater or a theater. We are not a spiritual version of other things that it seems so easy to just associate church like other things. We get something here, we go home, and we sort of disconnect and got what we needed for the day. We are actually people that God has called into his presence, into his love, into his family, and we are those people whether we're together or not. We have the same Jesus and the same Spirit of Christ living in us 24 hours a day, every day of the week, wherever we find ourselves. We have the same mission, the same purpose. We gather together so that we can just make that purpose more clear and strengthen ourselves in it. We have three directions of priority that are really important, and the easiest way that I've found or heard it said is simply up, in, and out. Up is we want to prioritize our relationship with God above all else. We look up to connect in relationship with God, and we do that in really simple ways. We do that through gathering and worshiping. We do that through getting up a few minutes before we have to rush out and spending quiet time in God's presence, reading his word, talking to him, listening to him. The second direction of up, in, and out is in, where we connect inside of our church community. We have real relationships where we're known. We're known enough so that people know beyond our face image. They know who we really are, and they know when we're having good days and bad days. We have relationships that are deep enough that we can speak into each other's lives, and we can challenge each other, or we can encourage one another. We're involved in one another's lives to help us go in the right direction. And then the third direction of up, in, and out is out. That we are not for ourselves, friends. We do not gather just so that we can feel good about what's going on. We gather in the name of Jesus to be sent to change the world. The power of Christ is in every single one of us, and it plays itself out in the places we go, in the simplest of ways, in the small nudges of God, but we reach out to people who are searching for God, and we help them find a way home. Whether it's a +1 person, or praying for a family member, or caring for a neighbor, or sharing your story about how God has helped you through a hard time, this outward movement defines the people that Jesus calls together. This morning I want to talk about a simple question. How do we have joy in hard times? Sometimes we mistakenly, as followers of Jesus, we mistakenly think that if we are doing the right things, if we are believing in God, then, this is this faulty if-then statement, if we're doing the right things, then life should be going correctly. If we are doing good, life should be feeling good, and we can live under that delusion for a while until we get a bad diagnosis, until our child is really struggling at school, until we find ourselves divorced and don't know how we got to this point, until we're grieving the loss of a loved one, until a dear friend says something so hurtful that it breaks the relationship, until we hit financial crisis and lose a job, and we realize hard times have come. Did I do something wrong? To ask this question about hard times, I simply want to highlight and dive into a little letter in the New Testament that Paul the Apostle wrote to a church in the city of Philippi. It's called the Epistle of Philippians. It's nicknamed the Book of Joy because Paul so frequently uses the word joy. And I want to take an imaginative journey into the setting of this letter and just let it soak in for what what Paul was experiencing when he wrote down these words. I want to read to you a good portion of this letter, and I just want to let the context and the words that Paul used speak to you, because it's good to think about how to have joy in hard times, because some of you are in hard times, and if you're not, you will be before you even want to. So this morning, I'd just like to invite you on that imaginative journey with me. Will you take it with me? Is anybody out there? Yeah. Okay. Imaginative journey just means use your imagination as we think about the background and the words of this passage. Paul had done a bunch of different traveling tours as he was planting churches all over the Mediterranean, all over the Roman Empire. One of the places he stopped was a little city called Philippi. Philippi was not a massive center of culture or economy, but it was a fairly important one. It was important partly because it was a coastal city, and also because it was on the way on a big highway called the Via Egnatia, and so there was a lot of traffic that came through Philippi. Philippi was a Roman colony, and so they really took pride in being Roman people. Their culture and their thought of their own citizenship was really that they belonged to the biggest empire in the world, and they were really proud of that. In fact, a lot of people who served in the military, high-ranking officials, when they were done with their career, they would retire and they would go chill out for the rest of their time at Philippi. Paul planted a church there, and he got to circle around and visit it a couple times. And he probably wrote them a few different letters just to encourage them, because the email was down that day, and so he had to actually pull out the Sharpie and write them a letter. One of the letters we actually have as part of our New Testament. Paul was not in Philippi when he wrote this letter. Actually, Paul was toward the very end of his missionary journeys ever in his life. He was way off in the city of Rome. Now, everything for Paul had sort of been leading up to Rome. He knew that if he could get to the heart of the empire and get Jesus communicated there, then he'd have a huge impact on the entire Roman Empire, which was the true case. So Paul, he didn't get there because he was taking vacation. He got there because he was on trial, and so he kind of went to the highest courts available, and he appealed to Caesar, and so he's found himself in Rome. And so he's in really a couple-year period of house arrest. That's when he's writing these letters. He had some dynamic days in his earlier ministry, but now things are pretty quiet. He can't really leave the house. He's not in a deep, dark dungeon chained to a block wall, but he is confined, and he's reliant on the support of his friends, and he doesn't have a lot of mobility. He can have people over, he can talk to them, and he can hang out with friends and tell them about Jesus, but he's pretty stuck. So with that kind of time on your hands, I know some of you would be requesting some devices and video games. He didn't have those, so he wrote letters, and one of the letters he wrote was to this church in Philippi. The church, when they heard that Paul was under house arrest and he was in the situation he was, they took an offering and they said, we want to send him a gift. We want to help him and support him. So everybody got together, they chipped in some money, and they sent him a gift. But they didn't just want to send him money, they wanted to support him. So they sent one of their church leaders, one of their kind of wiser, wealthier, older leaders named Epaphroditus. And so they gave him the money and said, Epaphroditus, we want you to go take this to Paul, and then we want you to stay with him and help him out for as long as he needs. So Epaphroditus took quite a long journey to find Paul in Rome. He met Paul. He gave him the gift from the Philippian church. And he was planning to stay with him. The problem was, when he got there, he must have caught this viral cough too, because he got really sick, but his turned deadly. In fact, he was on his deathbed, and Paul was sure he was going to lose him. So weeks go by, and there's no communication with the Philippians. They are not sure if he's alive or dead. And Paul's been really concerned about Epaphroditus, who's been not able to help him at all, really, once he got sick. And so once he gets better, Paul says, okay, I know you plan to stay with me for a long time, but I want to send you back. We've got to communicate and let them know what's going on, and they need to see you. They need to see you well. So he writes this letter, and he sends it with Epaphroditus. He sends him back to the Philippian church. Now you can imagine, after weeks and weeks of silence, weeks and weeks of unknown and prayer for Paul and for Epaphroditus, the church finally sees him coming, and they're so excited to see him back. They've just got their leader back, and they're really excited to hear what's going on with Paul and see if he's okay too. So Paul, you can imagine Epaphroditus coming back into his house Maybe he had a large house, maybe he's wealthier, and he just gathers the whole church in the second night he's there. Just says, everybody come, I want to give you an update about what's going on. Thank you for praying for me. So his whole courtyard of his house is just packed with people. There's just dozens of people there. The church of Philippi just comes together. And he gives them an update, but then he reads them this letter, which I'm going to read a good portion of it to you. And he says to them something like this, guys, Paul wrote a letter that I want to read to you. In fact, I watched him write it, so I can tell you about it if you want to know afterwards. Here's what he said. This letter is from Paul and Timothy, slaves of Jesus Christ. I'm writing to all of God's holy people in Philippi who belong to Christ, including the church leaders and deacons. Every time I think of you, Paul says, I give thanks to my God. Whenever I pray, I make requests for you with joy, for you've been my partners in spreading the good news about Christ from time to time, and since you first heard until now. And I'm certain that God, who began the good work in you, Philippian church, he will continue that work until it is finally finished on the day when Christ returns. And I want you to know that everything that has happened to me here in Rome has helped to spread the good news of Jesus. Everyone here, including the whole palace guard, knows that I am in chains because of Christ. And because of my imprisonment, most of the believers here, they've gained confidence and they boldly speak God's message in Rome without fear. For I fully expect that I will never be ashamed, but that I will continue to be bold for Christ as I have been in the past. And I trust that my life will bring honor to Christ whether I live or whether I die. For to me, living means living for Christ, and dying is actually even better. But if I live, I can do more fruitful work for Christ. So I really don't know which is better. I'm torn between two desires. I long to go and be with Christ, which is far better, but for your sakes it is better that I continue to live. Knowing this, I'm convinced that I will remain alive, so I continue to help all of you grow and experience the joy of your faith. Above all, Philippians. Isn't it funny how many times Paul says above all in his letters? Like, you should pick one. Because when you say above all, that means it's the biggest thing. But he tends to say above all a lot. But anyway, I'm just going to read it to you as he wrote it. Above all, you must live as citizens of heaven, conducting yourselves in a manner worthy of the good news about Christ. Do everything without complaining or arguing, so that no one can criticize you. Live clean, innocent lives as children of God, shining like bright lights in a world full of crooked and perverse people. Hold firmly to the word of life. Then on the day of Christ's return, I will be proud that I didn't run my race in vain and that my work wasn't useless. I'll rejoice, even if I lose my life. And yes, you should rejoice, and I will share in your joy. Meanwhile, I thought that I should send Epaphroditus back to you. He's a true brother and a fellow soldier. He was your messenger to me in my time of need. I am sending him because he has been longing to see you, and he was very distressed that you heard he was ill. He was ill. In fact, he almost died. But God had mercy on him and also on me, so that I wouldn't have to deal with sorrows after sorrows. So I'm anxious to send him back to you. Whatever happens, dear brothers and sisters in Philippi, rejoice in the Lord. I never get tired of writing to you these same things as I do it to safeguard your faith. I want to know Christ, and I want to experience the mighty power that raised Christ from the dead, and I want to suffer with him, sharing in his death, so that one way or another I'll experience the resurrection. Therefore, my dear brothers and sisters, stay true to the Lord. I love you and I long to see you. You're my joy. You're my crown for my work. Now, I want to appeal to you, Euodia and Syntyche. Ladies, please, because you belong to the Lord, settle your disagreement. Always be full of joy in the Lord. I say it again, rejoice. Let everyone see that you're considerate in all you do. And don't worry about anything. Instead, pray about everything. Tell God what you need and thank him for all he's done. Then you'll experience God's peace. And one final thing, above all. Fix your thoughts on what is true and honorable and right and pure and lovely and admirable. Think about things that are excellent and praiseworthy. Put into practice the things you saw me do, and the God of peace will be with you. As for me, I know how to live on almost nothing or with everything. I've learned the secret of living in any kind of situation, whether with a full stomach or an empty stomach, with plenty or a lot or a little. For I can do everything through Christ who gives me. Do you imagine being in the original reading of that letter and being Kentucky and he named you and you're there and you just kind of look at your shoes and go, oh my gosh, he just wrote me in his letter. How embarrassing. Yes, we've been arguing, but I didn't know it was that bad. Could you imagine hearing those letters, hearing those words from Paul delivered from Epaphroditus, and knowing what Paul is going through? Here he keeps saying, rejoice in the Lord. Don't worry, pray. And by the way, rejoice in the Lord and have joy in any circumstance, because I've learned the secret under house arrest and through my beatings and shipwreck and being lost and cold. There's a strength in Christ. You can imagine after that reading, people really appreciated the letter. They were glad to see their friend Epaphroditus back home. And they milled around, and he just said, hey, we're going to bring out some food, enjoy each other's company, don't rush off, I'm back. And as they all milled around, there were a few in the crowd who heard the letter that really wanted a few questions to be answered. Epaphroditus is talking, and then all of a sudden he sees from across the courtyard Phaedra coming walking toward him, a young lady in the church. A really beautiful young woman, but she's by herself, and she's got a distressed look on her face, and she comes up to him in quiet, and she said, Epaphras, you may notice my husband wasn't here tonight. He's really sick. He's been sick for weeks. In fact, I think we're going to lose him. And Paul talks about having this joy and rejoicing, but I don't know how I can rejoice. My husband is about to die. And even if I could rejoice, I don't think it would be right to have joy when he's in such a bad situation. I don't understand what Paul is expecting of me here. And Epaphroditus looks at her and says, you know, I don't know what it's like to be you, but I can really sympathize because I was just on my deathbed. And let me tell you, Paul says to rejoice, but I want to tell you, he was really worried about me too. And when people have faith in Jesus, it doesn't mean that when we face grief and when we face illness and when we face death that we have to shut down our emotions and put on this fake, smiley, happy face and pretend that everything's okay. Phaedra, that's not what Paul does. That's not what Jesus did. We can go through it and still hurt. But I just want to remind you that this illness and sometimes grief, it just comes in like a storm cloud. And when it comes in, it can come in so powerfully that you just feel surrounded, and it rains on you, and it hails and sleets, and it just consumes your life, and you feel so cold, and you can even forget that the sun is ever shining out there. You can just be so consumed that you forget there's any light and warmth beyond the storm. But then you remember in the middle of it that even though the storm is blocking everything that you can see and it's just hammering you, it will pass. And that the sun is still shining out there and it hasn't changed because of the storm. You just can't see it. Phaedra, we have that hope in Jesus. That's what Paul was talking about. That even in the middle of the storm, even if you're hurting, and no matter what happens to your husband, if he gets well or if he actually does finish his race and goes home to be with Jesus, the sun is still shining out there. The resurrection life of Jesus Christ is still yours and it's still mine. And we can't forget that. We can't get lost in the clouds. Phaedra, I'll get some of the friends and brothers and sisters from the church tomorrow, and we'll come over and pray for your husband. But I just want to remind you, no matter what happens to him, Jesus is still in charge. Hang on to him. He still wins. She looks a little relieved, and she walks away and sighs and has a little bit more hope in her step. And as soon as she goes, Epaphroditus, his heart's heavy for her husband because he knows her. But then a little guy comes running up from the side. He's been waiting to talk to Epaphroditus. His name is Titus. He's about 8 or 9. And he comes up and kind of hits him on the leg and says, Epaphras, I'm really worried about Paul. And you can tell that this little guy has been so deeply impacted. He remembers the last time Paul traveled through, and he liked Paul, and Paul talked to him, and they had this special connection, and it had been a while, but he totally remembers who this guy is. And so Epaphroditus leans down and he says, Titus, what's wrong? He says, I'm just so worried about Paul. I think he's going to die out there. And Epaphroditus puts his arm on his shoulder and says, Titus, you know, we're not really sure what's going to happen to Paul, buddy. He's in Caesar's hands, and Caesar could choose to end his life. That might happen. But I want to remind you of something. Paul is not afraid of Caesar. Paul's there because he wants to be there, because he believes that Jesus is with him, and Jesus is right there in that room with him, and no matter what happens to him, he believes that Jesus is Caesar's king. And you know Jesus too, don't you, Titus? And you know that no matter what Caesar decides to do, one day he's going to have to bow to Jesus Christ. So don't be afraid, Titus. Paul's not afraid. And you know what? Paul actually said, do you remember in that letter? Do you remember in that letter when he said every time he remembers us, whenever he thinks about us, even though we're far away, he doesn't get sad when he thinks about us and when he can't be with us. Whenever he remembers us, he actually thanks God and he has joy. Titus, you bring Paul joy. Did you know that? He smiles when he thinks about you, and he's so happy that you're living for Jesus. Do you think you could do the same thing, Titus? Do you think whenever you remember Paul, instead of being sad that he's far, do you think you could instead say, thank you, God, for Paul, and then be happy that you know him? Titus kind of shakes his head, yeah. You know what Paul said is that we're not meant to carry all those heavy things around. Instead of worrying, Titus, how about we just pray and we just trust God to take good care of Paul? Can we do that? Yeah. Titus got a smile back on his face, and he runs away, and he's playing with the other kids now. And already Epaphroditus feels the power of this letter. He feels the power of it working itself into the community. He feels the resistance to this joy, and he's working it out in the community. And then he sees a man who's a little bit older than him kind of walking fairly confidently across the courtyard. He's never seen this man other than tonight, and this man comes up to him and he introduces himself as Alexander. He's a newer member of the church. He's actually a retired Roman centurion, so he's lived in Philippi for a while, but he just came to know Jesus recently. In fact, while Epaphroditus was gone is when he joined the church. And he's got this confident gait about him from years of commanding troops, but in his eyes there's a deep sorrow. And he comes for a quiet conversation. He says, Epaphroditus, my name is Alexander. And I hear it. I hear what Paul is saying, that we must rejoice in every circumstance, but I don't see how I can. If you knew the things that I did, I've lived my whole life fighting and killing for the wrong empire. And I can't get those things out of my mind. And it's only recently, only at the last part of my life, that I've been introduced to Jesus. And now I know what the real kingdom is, but I feel so guilty about all the people that I've hurt. I can't get that out of my mind, Epaphroditus. I can't have joy from all those years lost. And I look around at these people in this room. I look around at my church now, my ecclesia, and I'm wealthier than almost every one of them because of all these things that I've done. And I wasn't even around to contribute to the gift you took for Paul. I don't have a light heart at all. And Epaphroditus looks at him. And he looks him in the face, and he looks him in those deep, sorrowful eyes, and he says, Alexander, Jesus forgives you. You weren't here when Paul told this story last time, but I want to tell you the story he told. He heard this from the 12, okay? When Jesus was dying on a Roman cross, Alexander drops his head because he's crucified many people in his career. When Jesus was dying, you know how it is, how hard it is to breathe and how long it is to die. And as Jesus was pushing up on the nails to gasp for breath, just to get another breath in his lungs, he said something. And you know how hard it is to even waste your breath to speak, but he said something when he looked down at those Roman soldiers that had nailed him to the wood. Do you know what he said, Alexander? He said, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. Alexander looks up. Did he really say that? Did he really say that about the soldiers? Yeah. Alexander, Jesus accepts you, but it's not because of all the good things that you've done. Do you remember in the letter I just read from Paul? Do you remember what he said about all his credentials? He was a pretty important guy he was a Pharisee. He had all these degrees and titles and a reputation. He'd done all these things that he was really proud about, but he'd also done all these things that he was horrified about. He killed Christians too. And once he came to know Jesus, he just put both piles together and brushed them aside and threw them in the garbage because all of his stuff, whether it was good or bad, meant nothing compared to receiving the grace and the love of Jesus Christ. Alexander, Jesus accepts you because he loves you, not because of what you've done, not because of what you failed to do. And by the way, I don't know if you caught it, but Paul said, above all, we have to live as citizens of heaven. Your whole life's been defined by being a Roman citizen and what that meant, and your rank and your status and your nation and your Caesar. That's not your citizenship. I mean, you're still a Roman citizen. You don't have to give that up, but you have a much higher calling now. However many days God gives you, live it out, Alexander. Live it out. Why don't you go home and pray tonight, and why don't you ask God what he wants you to do in his kingdom, in his citizenship, with his wealth that he's given you. Why don't you ask him that? And as he guides you, and as you're obedient and generous, and take steps, joy will follow. I promise you, joy will follow. Smile breaks out on this man's face. And for the first time, he feels like bricks are just dropping off the shoulders of his past years, and he's walking forward into a new hope. And then Epaphroditus notices one more. He saw Euodia leave the meeting when her name was mentioned in the letter. She backed out quietly and left the room, and here she's come back. She couldn't make it home. Her conscience must have been working on her. She comes to him and she says, listen, Epaphroditus, it's no secret. He called me out in the letter. And I've been fighting with Kentucky for so long that I don't even remember what it's about. But I see what it's doing to the whole church. People are taking sides. People are now taking offense at things that don't need to even be offensive for. And you know what? Honestly, as I was walking home, I didn't want to come back tonight. But I remembered why I started this whole fight. I'm just jealous of her. I mean, that's the truth. I'm just jealous of her because when I look at her life, it looks so perfect. And her kids seem to be doing so well, and mine are struggling. And her marriage seems to be so good, and mine has had its ups and downs. And I look at her life, and financially, they're rocking it, and we're not doing as well. And I look at her spiritual life, and she always seems to be put together, physically and spiritually. And I just feel like I'm so far away from that, and I don't know what to do. It's just caused this constant friction in the way I've been treating her. But it's really just because I'm jealous. How do I have joy? How do I make this right? Epaphroditus looks at her, and he's at the same time sad for what she's going through, but so happy that she came back because he knew he was going to have to deal with it tomorrow one way or another. And so he talks to her, and he says with kindness in his voice, Euodia, it reminds me of something in a different letter that I read from James. You remember James, the apostle? James said in one of his letters, what causes fights and quarrels among you? Don't they come from the desires that battle within your own heart? You want something, but you don't get it. You kill and you covet and you steal, but you still don't have what you want. You don't have what you want because you don't ask God. And when you ask him with the wrong motive, so you can get whatever you want and spend it on yourself and have your own pleasures gratified. Euodia, I think it's time to let that jealousy go and to go talk to Syntyche. Ask for her forgiveness. Are you willing to do that now? Because she's right there, and everybody already knows. This would be a powerful statement of God's reconciliation. And I promise you, when you get that out of the way, that joy will start coming back into not only you, but everybody who's been caught up into this whirlwind of conflict. She's willing. She shakes her head. And then Epaphroditus says, by the way, those feelings of jealousy that you have, I just want to remind you of what Paul said. Do you remember when I just read that he's learned the secret of being content in every kind of situation? I know that seems like a far cry from where you are right now, but the same Jesus can help you learn that as well. You can have contentment when things are going well or when they're not going well. Don't compare yourself to somebody else. You don't know what's going on in their life. Hang on to what Jesus is doing in your life and make your focal point him. And then you're going to have to do that other part too. You're going to have to fix your thoughts. Euodia, you're going to have to discipline your mind so that when you start to slip down into jealousy, you're thinking of what's true. When you start to look at somebody else in the wrong way, you have to ask yourself, would this honor God? Is this praiseworthy to God? Would he be glad and admire what this thought I'm harboring is? When it's not, you got to let it go, and you've got to think on what's true and right. And as you do that, things will begin to change in your heart. He walks over with her. They have the conversation and issue forgiveness, and the church takes a sigh of relief because they can feel the tension is gone. And that night, as everybody goes home from his courtyard, Epaphroditus is left with this letter from Paul, and he's just marveling at how this letter has already begun to stir and work out that salvation in the people of his church, and how already it's brought crisis and confrontation and freedom and forgiveness and change. And so he says tomorrow he's immediately going to have some of his workers begin to copy this letter because he knows of a few other churches that would like to hear it. And he knows of a few other conflicts that need to read about this. And so they make copies and they pass it on and they travel and they reach some of the other churches. And those churches read it, and it begins to work into the community, and it begins to change them, and it begins to release joy into their lives like they didn't have before. And so they copy, and they send it to other churches, and they read it, and it makes a difference, and they have joy, and they copy, and they send it, and they copy, and they send it, and they read it, and they copy, and they send, and they read for centuries. And it's copied and read and printed and posted, and now you and I are reading this same letter with the same command. I want to leave you with this. Rejoice in the Lord always. Let me say that one more time. Rejoice. No matter what circumstance you're going through. It probably is not as bad as Paul, who never made it out of house arrest. As those Christians in Philippi who, by knowingly coming to Christ, put their lives on the line. For some of them, it meant their life was now marked for death. Rejoice in the Lord. I'd encourage you, if you are going through a hard time, if you find yourself going through a hard time, take a few minutes, set aside half an hour, and read through the letter of Philippians. Read it out loud, read it a couple times, and I think you'll find that we're doing that same kind of work in your heart. I'd like to take 2 minutes and just give you a chance to process how God has been speaking to you through the letter of Philippians. Just simply talk to somebody around you about this question. We do this most weeks as a opportunity to begin processing and moving toward application this week, take 2 minutes and simply ask, what stood out to you most about the letter to the Philippians? Talk about that question out loud for a couple minutes, then I'll come back up in just a moment and begin communion. If you're a communion server, you can come up now and begin to prepare.
I want to remind you, next Sunday is Freedom Sunday, and I was actually at a concert last night, and they were talking about an organization that you can partner with to give that does really awesome work in the name of Jesus. And one of the people speaking about it said, I don't think God expects us to give out of our necessity, but I think he does out of our luxury. And that's a conviction I have, a belief I have. And so my wife and I are just praying about being open to God prompting us to give generously next week in the name of we exist as a church to share the hope and freedom. And what World Hope International does in freeing people from human trafficking, that is in the work of sharing hope and freedom. And so that's next Sunday. We're taking one offering, and whatever we raise is going to World Hope for that cause. I want to remind you too, whatever the circumstances, rejoice in the Lord. Again, I say rejoice. Now, may the love of God, the peace of Jesus Christ, and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with you as you go. You are sent, church. Have a great afternoon.